Sergeant Michael Torres had always lived a life of silence, discipline, and respect. For nearly a decade, he had stood guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. Every step, every turn, every movement of his body was practiced to perfection. People came from all over the country to watch the guards change, to see the soldiers in their flawless uniforms, to feel the deep respect that surrounded that sacred place. Michael had stood there through rain, wind, and blistering heat, never showing emotion, never breaking focus. That was his life. Order, respect, and duty. Now, for the first time in years, he was away from the marble silence of the tomb. His service had ended a few months earlier, and though he missed the uniform, he knew it was time to see the world beyond the cemetery gates. He booked a flight from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, hoping to visit an old Army friend and maybe spend a few days at the beach. The idea of relaxing felt strange to him. Soldiers like him didn't rest easily. Even as he sat at the airport gate, he noticed everything around him. The security guard's posture, the anxious family by the counter, the woman struggling to lift her suitcase. His eyes caught details others missed, a habit he couldn't turn off. When the boarding call came, he picked up his small bag and walked calmly toward the plane. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and recycled air. He found his seat near the window and placed his bag neatly under the seat in front of him. As the passengers filled in, he nodded politely to the flight attendant and buckled his seatbelt. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman smiled at him. Her silver hair was neatly tied, and she carried a gentle warmth in her eyes. She wore a small necklace with a photo charm inside it, and every now and then she looked at it with care. "First time flying this route?" she asked kindly. Michael smiled lightly. "First time flying anywhere in a while," he said. She laughed softly. "You sound like someone who's used to staying grounded." He chuckled quietly. "Something like that." Her name was Elaine Carter. She told him she was traveling to Los Angeles to see her daughter and her grandchildren. Her husband had passed away years ago, and her daughter had been insisting she visit for a long time. "I finally decided it's time," Elaine said. "I just hope the flight goes smoothly. I've never liked being in the air." Michael reassured her gently. "You'll be fine. These planes are safer than cars," he said, his calm voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had seen far worse dangers. As the engine started, the passengers settled into their seats. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Michael, though he had flown before, watched carefully, memorizing the exits, the positions of the attendants, and the layout of the cabin. It was second nature to him. Always be aware, always be ready. When the plane lifted off, he glanced out the window and saw the city shrinking below, the monuments and streets fading into patterns of light. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, people began to relax. A few passengers opened books, some started movies, and others drifted into sleep. Elaine leaned back with a smile and pulled out a small bag of snacks. She offered some to Michael, who politely declined but thanked her anyway. They talked a little about her family, his years of service, and how strange it was for him to travel without wearing a uniform. She seemed genuinely interested, asking gentle questions about his duty at Arlington. Michael spoke with quiet pride. "It's a place of honor. Every step we take is for those who can no longer walk. It's not just guarding a tomb, it's guarding what they stood for." Elaine nodded slowly. "That's beautiful. My son was a soldier too," she said softly. "He served overseas a few years ago." Michael gave a respectful nod. "Then you must be very proud." Her eyes glistened for a brief moment and she looked out the window. "I am," she whispered. After that, the conversation paused. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Michael closed his eyes not to sleep but to think. The years of standing guard had taught him patience. Stillness was part of who he was. But even now, away from the tomb, he could not completely let go of his alertness. Every sound, the click of a seatbelt, the whisper of a flight attendant, the creak of the overhead compartment was registered in his mind. An hour passed. The flight attendants came around with drinks and small meals. Michael took coffee. Elaine asked for tea. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled into the long flight. The view outside the window turned dark blue as the sun began to set. Michael watched the clouds glowing faintly in the dying light. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then suddenly he noticed movement in the aisle. A man stood up to stretch, but just behind him Elaine tried to stand and suddenly froze. Her teacup slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. The sound made Michael open his eyes at once. He saw her clutching her chest, her face pale, her breathing shallow. For a split second, no one reacted. Then someone gasped and a flight attendant shouted for help. But that moment belonged to Michael's training. He was already out of his seat before anyone else moved. The world around him seemed to slow down. The narrow aisle, the panicking voices, the flashing seatbelt light, everything blurred into the background. His focus locked on Elaine. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. She didn't answer. He gently lowered her onto her back, checking her pulse. It was weak. The flight attendants rushed over with the medical kit, their hands trembling slightly. Michael's tone was firm but not harsh. "Call for a doctor on board," he said. "And get the oxygen tank now." His words carried authority and people obeyed without question. A few passengers stood up, unsure what to do, while others watched in silence. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom calling for a doctor. No one responded. Michael began chest compressions, counting silently, his movements sharp and precise. He remembered the emergency training he had received years ago, during missions where every second mattered. His mind was focused only on her breathing, her pulse, her life. The rhythm of his hands matched the steady discipline of a soldier who never hesitated. "Stay with me," he murmured under his breath as he worked. The passengers watched in awe. The quiet soldier from the window seat had transformed into a figure of calm strength. Even the flight attendants, usually in control, looked to him for direction. One of them held the oxygen mask ready, while another counted the seconds on her watch. The cabin that had been filled with laughter and soft music now held only the sound of Michael's voice and the beating of his hands against Elaine's chest. Then faintly, she gasped. Her chest rose and a weak breath escaped her lips. Michael paused, checking her pulse again. It was still faint, but it was there. Relief washed over him, though his face showed only focus. He adjusted her position and instructed the attendants to keep her head supported. The passengers broke into quiet murmurs of gratitude, some even clapping softly, but Michael didn't acknowledge them. His eyes stayed on Elaine, watching for any sign of change. When the captain announced that they would be making an emergency landing in Denver, Michael finally leaned back. His muscles ached, but he didn't care. He just watched Elaine breathe, her face slowly regaining color. A flight attendant placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "You saved her." Michael simply nodded. "Just doing what needed to be done," he replied. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights flickered back on. The world returned to normal rhythm, the sound of the engines, the soft chatter, the rustle of bags. But for Michael, something inside had shifted. He had left his post at the tomb of the unknown soldier, yet his duty had followed him into the sky. Even at 30,000 feet, surrounded by strangers, the instinct to protect and serve had not faded. When the wheels touched down and the plane rolled to a stop, the paramedics were already waiting. As they carried Elaine away on a stretcher, Michael stood quietly near the exit, his face calm but thoughtful. The passengers thanked him one by one, calling him a hero. He shook his head politely, saying little. For him it wasn't heroism. It was just another kind of watch, different ground, same purpose. He stepped off the plane into the cool Denver air, unaware that this single act would soon uncover a truth that would leave him speechless, a truth that tied his life to hers in a way he could never have imagined. The loud hum of the plane engine slowly faded as the flight landed in Denver. The moment the doors opened, a team of paramedics rushed in. Michael stepped aside, making space for them as they carried their equipment down the narrow aisle. His calm eyes followed their movements, making sure Elaine was treated with care. She was still breathing, her face pale but peaceful. As the paramedics lifted her carefully onto the stretcher, she opened her eyes for a brief moment. Her gaze met Michael's. There was confusion, fear, and something like gratitude in that faint look. He gave her a reassuring nod, the kind of silent promise soldiers make, that everything would be all right. The other passengers began clapping softly again, this time not out of excitement but out of relief and respect. The captain himself came out of the cockpit and shook Michael's hand. "You saved a life today," he said firmly. Michael just replied anyone would have done the same. The captain smiled slightly, sensing that Michael meant every word but also carried something deeper, that quiet weight soldiers often hide behind calm eyes. As the paramedics carried Elaine off the plane, the crew asked Michael if he wanted to stay in Denver or continue on the next flight. The airline offered to cover his hotel if he needed rest. But Michael, still steady though exhausted, said, "I'll continue to Los Angeles. There's nothing more I can do here now." He watched as the stretcher disappeared through the airport doors, then turned back toward the plane. The world moved normally again. Passengers talking, attendants collecting trash, people texting on their phones. Yet Michael felt as if he had stepped out of time. Something about that woman, about the way she had looked at him before being taken away, stayed in his mind. Once seated again, he gazed out the window as the next flight prepared to take off. His reflection on the glass looked tired but composed. He thought of the tomb, the endless silence, the footsteps echoing in perfect rhythm, the feeling of watching over the fallen. He had spent years honoring those who gave everything for their country, but that honor had always been quiet, unseen. Today was different. For the first time in a long while, his actions had been witnessed and they had directly saved a life. The plane rose again into the dark sky. The clouds outside glowed faintly in the moonlight. Michael tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elaine's face. First smiling beside him, then struggling to breathe. He replayed every second in his mind, wondering if he had done enough, wondering what had caused her to collapse so suddenly. He hoped she would recover. When the flight landed in Los Angeles, he stepped off quietly, collected his bag, and walked through the busy airport. People hurried around him, laughing, calling friends, dragging luggage. To them, it was just another night, but to him, it felt different, as if life had quietly reminded him that his purpose didn't end with the army. Over the next 2 days, Michael tried to settle into his trip. He met his old army friend, John, who now worked as a security consultant. They talked about their years in service, about how strange it felt to live in the civilian world again. Over lunch, John leaned back and said, "You look like something's still on your mind." Michael nodded slowly. "There was an emergency on the flight here. A woman collapsed. I helped her until the paramedics arrived." John whistled softly. "Always the soldier, huh? You can take the man out of duty, but not the duty out of the man." Michael gave a faint smile. "Maybe, but there was something about her. I can't explain it. She mentioned her son was a soldier too." "Do you know who he was?" John asked. "No," Michael said quietly. "She only said he served overseas." John shrugged. "Well, I'm sure she's grateful you were there. You probably saved her life." Michael nodded again but said nothing more. That night, after his friend left, he sat on the hotel balcony overlooking the city lights. The sounds of Los Angeles, the distant traffic, the hum of people, surrounded him. Yet his thoughts were far away, floating somewhere above the clouds. He couldn't forget the image of that necklace around Elaine's neck, the one with the tiny photo inside. He hadn't seen it clearly, but he remembered the flash of a young man's face smiling in uniform. The next morning, he received an unexpected phone call. The airline representative from Denver wanted to thank him again for his quick actions. "Mr. Torres," she said kindly, "the passenger you helped, Mrs. Elaine Carter, was stabilized after landing. She's in a hospital here in Denver. Her daughter asked us to give you their gratitude." "You really did save her." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. "I'm glad she's all right," he said softly. "She wanted to know your name," the representative added. "We told her only your first name since we didn't have more details, but if you'd like, I can pass a message." Michael paused for a moment. He wasn't used to praise or attention. Still, he said quietly, "Just tell her I'm happy she's safe. That's all she needs to know." After the call ended, he sat for a long time staring at the phone in his hand. He wondered if that was the end of it, a moment of fate now gone like a passing storm. But something in his chest told him this wasn't over. Sometimes life connects people for reasons hidden beneath layers of time and memory. A few days later, another call came, this time from the same hospital in Denver. The nurse on the line explained that Elaine was awake and recovering well. "She keeps talking about you," the nurse said warmly. "She says she feels like she's met you before, though she can't remember when." Michael frowned slightly, puzzled. "That's not possible," he said. "We only met on the plane." "Well," the nurse replied, "she insists your name sounds familiar. Maybe it's just the medicine talking." He thanked the nurse and ended the call, but the thought stayed in his mind. How could she possibly recognize him? He had never met her before, at least not that he could remember. Still, he decided to send her a short note through the hospital's online message system. It was simple. "Dear Mrs. Carter, I'm glad to hear you're recovering. It was my honor to help. Wishing you a full recovery and peace. Michael Torres." He didn't expect a reply, but 2 days later, one came. Her message was written slowly as if typed by shaky hands. "Dear Mr. Torres, thank you for saving my life. I've been thinking about our conversation. You said you served at the tomb of the unknown soldier. My son was buried at Arlington years ago. I wonder if you might have ever stood guard there when he was laid to rest. His name was Sergeant David Carter. He was my only child." Michael read the message twice, his hands tightening slightly. The name, Sergeant David Carter, maybe stirred something deep in his memory. He had guarded thousands of fallen soldiers during his years of service. Each one represented an untold story, but some names stayed with him, and this one echoed like a quiet bell. He remembered attending a special service at Arlington years ago, a ceremony for a fallen hero whose family had traveled across the country to honor him. Could it have been her son? He leaned back slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. The woman he had saved midair was the mother of a soldier he might have once guarded, a soldier who had given everything. Life, it seemed, had brought two paths together in the most unexpected way. That night, as he sat in silence again, he realized something powerful. His duty had not ended when he took off the uniform. It had only changed its form. Perhaps this was fate's way of reminding him that honor and service were not tied to a place or a rank. They lived within him, no matter where he went. He looked up at the stars over Los Angeles, the same sky that stretched over Arlington, and whispered quietly, "Rest easy, soldier. I'll watch over her now." Michael sat quietly in his hotel room, holding the printed message from Elaine in his hands. The name Sergeant David Carter stayed in his thoughts like a distant echo. He read the lines again and again, trying to remember if he had ever seen the soldier's name before. In the Tomb Guard platoon, he had stood through hundreds of ceremonies and funerals. Each time he had watched grieving families, saluted the folded flags, and heard the mournful tune of the bugle. It was his duty to remain still, silent, and strong. But behind that silence, he had always wondered who those people were. The mothers, the fathers, the wives, the children who cried for the ones they lost. Now one of those families had unknowingly crossed his path again. The same mother whose son's sacrifice he might have once honored now owed her life to him. It felt almost unreal. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at work, something beyond chance. The next morning, he decided to visit Arlington's online memorial records. The website listed every soldier laid to rest there. When he typed in David Carter, several names appeared, but one caught his eye. It read, "Sergeant David Michael Carter, killed in action, Afghanistan, 2013. Buried, Section 60, Arlington National Cemetery." Michael's breath caught for a second. That year, he had been on active duty as a tomb guard. He remembered that section clearly. It was one of the newest and most visited. He had been on duty the day a mother laid a single white rose on a fresh grave before sunset. He remembered, standing motionless as she whispered something over the headstone. Could that have been Elaine? He closed the laptop slowly. The thought filled him with quiet awe. Somehow, years later, fate had placed them together on that flight. The guard and the mother of a soldier he had once saluted. Later that day, he called the hospital in Denver. When the nurse recognized his name, she sounded cheerful. "Mrs. Carter's doing much better," she said. "She's been talking about you every day. Would you like to speak to her? She's been hoping you'd call." For a moment, Michael hesitated. He wasn't used to emotional conversations. As a soldier, he had learned to keep his feelings private, but something told him he needed to take this call. When Elaine's voice came through the line, it was gentle but weak. "Mr. Torres?" she said slowly. "Yes, ma'am, it's me," Michael replied quietly. There was a pause. "I wanted to thank you again," she said. "The doctors told me how close it was. I don't remember everything, but I remember seeing your face before everything went dark. I thought," her voice trembled slightly, "I thought it was my son for a moment. You looked so calm, just like he did." Michael's throat tightened. "I was only doing what I could," he said softly. "I'm glad you're safe now." She took a deep breath. "You mentioned the tomb of the unknown soldier. My son was buried at Arlington. He always spoke about the honor of being remembered there. Maybe you were one of those guards." "It's possible," Michael said after a moment. "I served there that year. I remember a lot of ceremonies, but some moments stand out more than others." Elaine was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly, "If you ever come back to Arlington, would you visit his grave for me? It's section 60, grave 5427. Michael nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see him. "Yes, ma'am," he said firmly. "I promise I will." When the call ended, Michael sat back and let the silence fill the room. That promise felt heavier than any duty he had carried before. It wasn't an order or a command. It came from something much deeper: respect, connection, and the invisible bond between those who serve and those who wait for them at home. A week later, Michael returned to Washington, D.C. He had planned to spend more time in Los Angeles, but his heart told him to go back. He couldn't explain it clearly, but he felt drawn to Arlington once more. On a bright morning, he walked through the gates of the cemetery, dressed in simple civilian clothes. The white headstones stretched endlessly before him, shining in the sunlight. The air was still and peaceful, broken only by the sound of the wind brushing the trees. As he made his way to Section 60, memories flooded back. His first day as a tomb guard, the hours of training, the countless footsteps he had taken in silence. When he finally found grave 5427, he stopped. The name on the stone was clear: Sergeant David Michael Carter. Below it was written, "Beloved son, faithful soldier, forever remembered." Michael stood there for a long time. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood the way he used to, tall, steady, and silent. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and gave a sharp salute. For a moment, it felt like time had folded in on itself. Years ago, he had honored this soldier without knowing him. Now he did it again, not as a guard, but as a man who had unknowingly saved the life of the soldier's mother. When he finally lowered his hand, he placed a small white rose on the grave, just as he remembered her doing years ago. It felt right. A circle completed, a promise fulfilled. Later that day, he called Elaine again. "I visited your son's grave," he said quietly. Her breath caught on the other end. "You did?" she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Torres. I don't have words." "He was a good man," Michael said gently. "And I think he's still watching over you." There was a long silence, and then Elaine said, "Maybe that's why you were there that day. Maybe it wasn't just luck." Michael didn't answer right away. He looked around the peaceful rows of white stones. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe some duties never end." That night, back at his apartment, Michael couldn't sleep. He sat by the window looking at the faint lights of the city. He thought about all the people he had met in his life: soldiers, families, strangers. Most encounters faded with time, but some stayed forever. Saving Elaine had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. It reminded him that service didn't always mean standing guard with a rifle. Sometimes it meant simply being there when someone needed you. No orders, no medals, just humanity. The next morning, he received a letter from Elaine. She had handwritten it, her neat script stretching across the page. It read, "Dear Mr. Torres, I wanted to thank you once more, not just for saving my life, but for reminding me that my son's spirit still moves through this world in ways we cannot see. When I look back at that day on the plane, I believe David sent you. You were calm, brave, and kind. Everything he used to be. You helped me when no one else could, just like he always did. Please know that I'll never forget you. With gratitude, Elaine Carter." Michael read the letter several times, his heart full. For the first time since leaving the army, he felt peace. It wasn't about duty anymore. It was about purpose. He realized that the same values he had lived by, honor, respect, and selfless service, weren't meant to end with his military career. They were meant to guide the rest of his life. He placed the letter in a small wooden box along with his medals and a folded flag, symbols of a life spent in service. Then he whispered softly, "Thank you, David. You brought me back to what matters." Outside, the morning sun rose quietly over Washington, bathing the city in golden light. Michael stood by the window, his silhouette calm and strong, as if still guarding something unseen. The tomb of the unknown soldier had taught him discipline and silence, but this experience had taught him something even greater, compassion beyond the uniform. And somewhere in a hospital bed in Denver, Elaine Carter smiled at the same morning light, holding her son's photograph close. Two lives, once strangers, were now forever connected by one moment at 30,000 feet, a moment that proved that duty, love, and fate often walk hand in hand. Days passed after Michael's visit to Arlington, yet the memory of Elaine Carter remained vivid in his mind. Every quiet moment, every walk through the city streets seemed to bring back fragments of that day on the plane. Her face, her frail hands, the rapid pulse he had tried to steady. Michael's life had returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed inside him. He could no longer ignore the connection that fate had created between them. One morning, Michael received a call from Elaine herself. The sound of her voice brought a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. She was recovering well and had finally been able to leave the hospital. "Mr. Torres," she began hesitantly, "I know it might be unusual, but I want to meet you in person. I want to thank you properly." Michael paused. Meetings like this were not part of his world. He was a soldier trained to observe, to serve quietly, to stand back from attention. Yet something about her request felt right. "I'd be happy to meet you," he said finally. "When and where?" They arranged to meet in Denver near a small park outside the hospital. Michael traveled by train, observing the city as he went, his mind replaying the journey that had brought him here. When he arrived, the crisp autumn air carried a gentle breeze that rustled the fallen leaves. Elaine was already waiting, seated on a bench, holding the same photo of her son that she had shown him on the plane. She stood as he approached, smiling with gratitude and a quiet nervousness. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Michael nodded, unsure of what to say. "I had to," he replied. You've been in my thoughts ever since." His voice was calm, but underneath was an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. They walked slowly through the park, talking quietly about her recovery, her life, and her memories of David. Elaine shared stories of her son's childhood, his love for the outdoors, his determination to serve, and the pride she felt the day he graduated from the Army. Michael listened, absorbing every detail. He realized that each story was not just about David, but about the life Elaine had shared with him. The love, the small moments, the sacrifices that often go unnoticed. At one point, they stopped by a small pond. Ducks floated lazily on the water, and the sunlight reflected off the surface in sparkling patterns. Elaine turned to Michael, her eyes glistening. "When I first saw you on the plane, I didn't know why, but something about you felt familiar, calm, safe. You reminded me of him, of David. I felt like he was still there watching over me." Michael's chest tightened. "It was instinct," he said quietly. I didn't think about anything else but making sure you were all right." "No," she said gently. "It was more than that. You saved my life. And more than that, you brought me hope. You reminded me that even in the darkest moments, someone can step in when you least expect it, just like my son always would have." For a long moment, they stood silently, watching the water. Michael thought of the tomb of the unknown soldier, the silence, the precision, the discipline, and how it had prepared him not just for ceremonial duty, but for moments like this. Life, he realized, demanded vigilance and courage in ways that no training could fully teach. Saving Elaine had been a test not of skill alone, but of presence, calm, and determination. And in that moment, he understood that every second of training, every long hour of guarding had prepared him to act without hesitation when it mattered most. They resumed walking, speaking of lighter things, the beauty of Denver, the change of seasons, and the quiet joys of life that often go unnoticed. Michael found himself smiling more freely than he had in years. It was strange, he thought, how one encounter could shift perspective so completely. He had always lived by structure and duty, yet Elaine's gratitude reminded him of the human connections that made life meaningful beyond orders and protocols. Later, as they sat on a park bench, Elaine turned to him with a question that weighed on her heart. "I've wondered," she began slowly, "was there any way you could have known who I was before the flight? Or was it just chance?" Michael shook his head. "I don't think it was chance. Maybe fate in a way. Something guided us together that day. You were in danger, and I happened to be there. But maybe it was more than just luck. Maybe life has its way of connecting people when they need it most." Elaine smiled, tears forming in her eyes. "I believe that," she whispered. "I think David sent you." Michael looked at her, the weight of her words settling quietly. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps some forces in life worked silently, moving people together in moments of need. For a man who had always relied on order, discipline, and control, it was a thought that both humbled and inspired him. They spent the afternoon together, walking through the quiet streets of Denver, sharing stories of family, hope, and resilience. Michael noticed small details he had missed before. The strength in Elaine's posture despite her recent illness, the warmth in her voice, and the courage that had carried her across the years. He realized that saving her life had been more than an act of duty. It had been a bridge between past and present, grief and healing, life and memory. As the day drew to a close, Michael escorted Elaine back to her temporary apartment. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being there when I needed it most, for saving me, and for caring, even when I was a stranger to you." He smiled gently. "It was my duty to help, and I'm glad I was able to do it, but thank you as well for reminding me why we do what we do. Not just out of duty, but out of humanity." Elaine nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I think David would have been proud of you," she said quietly. Michael didn't respond with words. He simply nodded, feeling the truth of her statement resonate deeply within him. He had spent years honoring the fallen, standing still in silent devotion, but now he understood that the living could also carry the lessons of the dead. The values he had learned, courage, vigilance, and selflessness, were not limited to ceremonies or uniforms. They were living principles guiding every action, every choice, every step in life. Before leaving, Michael promised Elaine that he would remain in contact. Not out of obligation, but out of respect and connection. "I'll check on you," he said simply, "to make sure you continue to heal." "I would like that," she replied. "It would mean a lot to me." As he walked away that evening, the Denver sun dipping behind the buildings, Michael felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Saving Elaine had been an extraordinary moment, yes, but it had also reminded him of the invisible threads that tie people together. Threads of duty, love, fate, and memory. The world seemed larger now, yet smaller at the same time. One act of courage could ripple far beyond the immediate moment, touching lives in ways one could never predict. Back in his hotel, Michael reflected on everything that had happened. The flight, the emergency, the connection to Elaine and her son. It all felt like a story written in invisible ink, revealed only through action, courage, and chance. He realized that life had a way of testing a person's values long after the uniforms were gone, long after the ceremonies ended. Moments like these were rare, yet they were what defined the measure of a person. That night he wrote a letter to Elaine, not because it was necessary, but because it felt right. He expressed his gratitude for her trust, his respect for her courage, and his hope that she would continue to find strength in the memory of her son. He didn't include any grandeur or exaggeration, just the simple truth that her life mattered, that her story mattered, and that he had been honored to play even a small part in it. As he folded the letter and placed it in the envelope, Michael looked out the window at the city lights below. Somewhere above, invisible and silent, life had connected him to Elaine Carter in a way he could never have predicted. And somewhere in that connection, he felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that duty, honor, and humanity could sometimes intersect in the most unexpected ways. The day ended with a calm stillness. Michael slept deeply that night, carrying with him a renewed sense of purpose. He understood now that heroism was not always about recognition, medals, or ceremonies. Sometimes it was about presence, courage, and unwavering attention in the moments that mattered most. Sometimes it was about answering the call of fate with an open heart and steady hands. And in the quiet of the night, as the stars shone over Denver, Michael felt a profound peace, knowing that life in its mysterious way had brought him and Elaine together. It was a bond neither of them could have anticipated, yet it was real and it was enduring. After the meeting in Denver, Michael returned to Washington, D.C., but he could not shake the feeling that his journey with Elaine Carter had only just begun. Every time he walked past the monuments or even glanced at Arlington from a distance, memories of that flight, the emergency, and the promise he had made to visit David's grave resurfaced. It was no longer just about duty. It was about connection, a bond between the living and the memories of those who had passed. Michael decided to make a small ritual part of his life. Each weekend he would visit Arlington, not just to honor the unknown soldiers, but to stand quietly at David's grave. He would salute, leave a rose, and take a moment to reflect. Each visit became easier yet deeper. He began to recognize that every soldier buried there had a story, a family, and a life that had been interrupted too soon. In honoring them, he honored humanity itself. One morning he received a letter in the mail from Elaine. It was a simple note written carefully, her handwriting neat and precise. "Dear Michael, I cannot express enough how grateful I am. Each time you visit David's grave, I feel a presence with me, as if his spirit knows he is not forgotten. I wanted you to know that your actions on the plane saved more than my life. You brought me hope and reminded me that even after loss, life continues in meaningful ways. With gratitude and affection, Elaine Carter." Michael held the letter in his hands for a long moment. He read it over and over, feeling the weight of her words. Saving Elaine had started as an act of duty, a reflex born from years of discipline, but it had blossomed into something far greater, a connection that transcended time and circumstance, linking the past and present in ways he could never have predicted. Months passed. Michael continued his routine of visits to Arlington. He often imagined the day he first met Elaine on the plane, the fear in her eyes and the fleeting moments before he had acted. Each memory reinforced a truth he had always known but seldom experienced firsthand. Courage was not defined by training alone. It was defined by presence, by attention, and by the willingness to act in the service of others. No matter how ordinary or extraordinary the moment. One sunny afternoon, as Michael placed another white rose on David's grave, he noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Elaine. She walked slowly, leaning slightly on a cane, her face lighting up when she saw him. He rose and greeted her with a nod, his posture still disciplined yet warmer than usual. "I wanted to see him." "And you," Elaine said softly, motioning to the grave. "I wanted to make sure he knows he is remembered and to thank you in person again." Michael nodded. "He is remembered," he said, "and I am honored to help keep that memory alive." They stood in silence for a few moments, listening to the wind rustle the leaves and the faint, distant sounds of visitors walking along the cemetery paths. It was a quiet moment, unremarkable in the world's eyes, but profound to them. It was a moment of reflection, of connection, and of understanding that life, despite its unpredictability, carried its own order and meaning. Over the next hour, they talked about small things: Elaine's plans to return home, the gardens around Arlington, and the changing seasons. Michael realized that these simple conversations, free of urgency and danger, held a quiet power of their own. The connection between them was no longer defined by emergency or crisis. It was defined by mutual respect, gratitude, and shared memory. As they prepared to leave, Elaine turned to Michael, her eyes glistening. "I will never forget you," she said, "and I will never forget this, that one person at one moment can change everything." Michael felt a deep sense of peace. "Nor will I," he replied quietly. "Sometimes life places us in the right place at the right time. It's not about luck, and it's about presence, awareness, and courage. You reminded me of that." As they parted ways, Michael continued to walk through Arlington, thinking about all the lives touched by duty, sacrifice, and human connection. He reflected on the years he had served as a tomb guard, silent, precise, and disciplined, and realized that the true measure of his service had never been in ceremony alone. It had been in the countless invisible threads that connected him to those who lived and those who had passed. Weeks later, Michael received another note from Elaine, this one accompanied by a small photo of David in his army uniform. She had written, "Dear Michael, every time I look at this photo, I think of you and the life you saved. You carried honor in action, not just in uniform. Thank you for reminding me that courage and love endure. With heartfelt thanks, Elaine Carter." Michael placed the photo on his desk next to his military medals and a folded flag. It was a reminder of the bond formed in extraordinary circumstances and of the quiet heroism that often goes unseen. One evening, as he sat by the window watching the sunset, Michael reflected on the chain of events that had led him here, from standing silently at the tomb of the unknown soldier, to saving a life at 30,000 feet, to honoring the memory of a fallen soldier. It was a story of connection, fate, and courage. And he understood that the world was full of such stories, often unnoticed, yet profound in their impact. Michael knew he would never forget Elaine, David, or the events that had brought them together. But he also knew that the lessons from this experience extended far beyond them. They were lessons about life itself, about paying attention, acting with courage, and caring for others even in moments of uncertainty. In the quiet of the night, he stood on his balcony and looked out at the stars. Somewhere he imagined David's spirit watching over them both, and he whispered a silent promise. He would continue to honor the fallen, protect the living, and act with courage whenever the moment demanded it. And as Elaine slept peacefully in Denver, thinking of her son and the soldier who had saved her life, Michael felt a quiet warmth in his heart. Life had a way of testing, teaching, and connecting people in ways they could never fully predict. Sometimes it took a soldier's presence, a mother's hope, and a moment of fate to reveal the extraordinary power of humanity. Michael knew now, more clearly than ever, that the true meaning of service did not end when the uniform came off. It lived on in actions, in compassion, and in the lives touched quietly but profoundly. That knowledge gave him purpose, peace, and a deeper understanding of the invisible bonds that unite us all. The story of that flight, of a sudden emergency, and of a mother and a soldier's connection would remain with him forever. It was a story of courage, honor, and humanity. A story that reminded him that one act, one presence, one decision at the right moment could change a life, and perhaps even the world, in ways that mattered beyond measure. Michael turned away from the window, letting the night settle around him. He knew that tomorrow would bring ordinary moments, yet each could hold extraordinary meaning if approached with attention, care, and courage. And somewhere beyond the clouds a mother smiled. A soldier's memory endured, and a tomb guard's duty quietly continued. Not just over the fallen, but over the living as well.